Respect your elders. That's what we've all been told, right? I've heard it throughout my 16 years of life, and chances are someone said it to you at some point as well. Because just about every generation of humans since the beginning of history has held their elders in high regard, valuing age and the wisdom that comes with it. So respect for our elders is something that's become quite deeply ingrained in our culture. But in my 3 years working as a youth advocate with various youth organisations, facilitating discussions between young and old on a regular basis, I've seen a reality far different to this old adage. Many young people don't respect their elders. Surprise, surprise. But equally, a lot of older people, especially those in positions of authority, feel the same way towards young people. So as someone who's passionate about helping to give young people a voice at the table, this poses a real challenge. See, our society is made up, or can be made up, of two large intergenerational groups, divided by the birth year 1984. Now, the reason this year was selected as the sort of centre point is a complex mix of cultural, political and technological factors, but the main one being that those born after 1984 generally grew up in a much more digitally augmented society than those born before. So let's do a quick show of hands. Raise your hand if you were born before 1984. And be honest with me, because this is where I decide which jokes I'm not going to tell. Okay, so you guys are mostly going to be Gen Xers and baby boomers. There may be some of that silent generation before baby boomers with us as well. Now, raise your hand if you were born after 1984. Okay, so you guys are going to be millennials and what we call post-millennials. So post-millennials are people like me, born after 2000. It's kind of scary, right? They're letting us do TED Talks now. Now, we've got a pretty even split, so most of my jokes are gone, but that's all right, we'll move on. Anyway, these two groups seem increasingly at odds with one another. And I believe that this compromises our ability to work together to make a difference. See, most of us can agree that when we're trying to make a difference, we have to be able to work across a wide range of demographics and find that common ground that allows incredible things to happen. And in most cases, that includes a wide range of ages. But as young people in a world where the majority of big decision makers are older than us, it can be difficult to reach that common ground. And equally, for a lot of older people in these positions, it can be hard to bridge that gap with the younger generation who seem more foreign than ever. Now, I've seen this many times descend into a kind of intergenerational mudslinging match, which is very much spurred on by the media with their kind of sensationalised hyperbole around people of different generations. But the reason I'm here is that, unfortunately, we're all at risk of buying into that. So this got me thinking, what is it about these generations, or is there something about these generations that makes it so hard for them to work together? Was there some explanation for this phenomenon that I'd seen occur on so many occasions firsthand? And most importantly, how could we overcome this in order to make a difference? So I started searching for answers. And this was the fun part. I did as any self-respecting researcher would, and I started with the New York Post. They had an incredibly interesting and evidently unbiased article entitled, "I'm a Millennial and my generation sucks." I was in for a treat. What followed was more or less a template for virtually every other article about millennials that I've read since, using up every available word in the anti-Generation Y lexicon. Some of my favourites were lazy, narcissistic, dependent, and the crown jewel, entitled. Now, after a few more weeks of filling my brain up with the literature of the crusade against the young, I was just about ready to jump ship and join my parents' generation. Because what I'd learned so far was that millennials are the laziest generation in history, that they all live with their parents in houses stacked to the ceiling with participation trophies, and that the reason they can't afford their own houses is that they spend all of their money on avocado on toast. I finally understood why older people don't like young people. Millennials suck. But it was time to look at the other side, What did these avocado-loving, selfie-taking snowflakes have against their hard-working and long-suffering parents and grandparents? Well, my first stop was the Huffington Post, who had an insightful piece which asked the question, are boomers a generation of sociopaths? And this is where I really had to eat my words, right? Because sure, they acknowledged, millennials might be lazy, self-obsessed and financially illiterate, but they claimed it was the boomers who taught it to them. These guys racked up debts, started wars, burned through resources, created climate change on the side, and then offloaded this whole flaming mess of a planet to their kids in a hospital pass of selfishness, indifference, and greed. Phew! I finally understood why young people don't like older people. Boomers suck. So at this point, I was thoroughly deflated. How can we work together to make a difference when we all just suck this much? So I decided to find out where we went wrong, to locate that exact point in history when young people suddenly stopped respecting their elders and older people got all grumpy. So I went back to 1990 as a starting point. And when I say went back, I don't mean jumped in a time machine, although that would have made for a much more interesting talk, sorry. I went back and looked at old magazine and newspaper articles to try and find the voice of the time on young people. So, 1990, what did Time magazine have to say about 20-somethings back then? They crave entertainment, but their attention span is as short as one zap of a TV dial. Now, I didn't actually know what a TV dial was or what a zap of one would constitute, but it didn't sound good. I had to go back further. I tried 1976 to see what some of those boomers were getting up to when they were kids. The New York Times said, quote, the youth of today are too busy navel-gazing to care about politics. The now generation has become the me generation. Now sure, it was proving difficult to find that time before young people were selfish and ignorant, but I had to push on. I tried 1968. Life magazine said of young people, quote, the phrase making a living has absolutely no meaning to these children of the affluent society. Nope, still lazy and dependent. Now, I was thinking about giving up at this point, but I decided in one last-ditch effort to go back to the earliest year I could possibly think of, 1907. Quote, the rock upon which most of the flower-bedecked marriage barges go to pieces is the latter-day cult of individualism. The worship of the brazen calf of the self, said the Atlantic, of those young whippersnappers born a few years before the turn of the century, who were now filing for divorce like there was no tomorrow, to the horror of their parents. Now, you've probably noticed a theme here, and it's true. Every generation of young people has been the worst generation, the laziest generation, the me generation. Even Plato was moaning about young people in 400 BC. So the problem with young people today is not a new one. And it's got, oh, there's Plato. And it's got nothing to do with participation trophies or selfie sticks or even avocado on toast. It's the same problem that every generation before them had. They're young. We know that young people can be naive and selfish and spiteful towards their elders and not very kind to long-standing social norms. But they're also compassionate, innovative, empowered, and engaged. So for those of you born before 1984, and I know who you are now, think back to what you were really like back in the day. Take a moment to ignore the apparent lack of interest or motivation amongst the young and appreciate us for what we can offer. A fresh perspective, creative ideas, and an in-depth understanding of why your computers are not working. But for those young people out there who are looking a little too smug at this point, I've got a message for you as well. You still have to respect your elders. Respect their wisdom and experience, their constructive feedback, and most importantly, their input on what you probably shouldn't put on Facebook for future employers to see. And here's some interesting food for thought for everyone in the room. Every generation in here, whether they're over 65s or under 30s, despite their differences, have something big in common. And that is a deep-seated hatred of bureaucracy. All of these generations have demonstrated at some point in history their preference for leading with action, hands-on, boots on the ground, rather than via the ballot box. So whilst this missing million might be a massive problem for the political establishment, it's an equally huge opportunity for community groups and service organisations who've traditionally struggled to engage with younger people. Now, of course, making a difference is easier said than done. But what I'm trying to get across is that dividing ourselves by something as trivial as age, by these arbitrary lines in the sand drawn up by God knows who, really puts us on the back foot. Every distracted glance at a phone screen during a meeting or condescending nod of the head represents 2 steps backwards for each one that we might manage to take forward. So we don't have a generational problem. We just have generations. Because for as long as humans inhabit the earth, we'll have rolling of eyes and reminiscing about the good old days and spiteful articles in the media trying to get us at each other's throats. But we'll also have discoveries made and lives saved and bridges built and, missing million. I missed my other slide. And unlikely collaborations between Paul McCartney and Lady Gaga. These are all things that involve young people and older people working together. And they're also the things that really make a difference. So the next time you find yourself tearing your hair out over a younger co-worker's apparent inability to perform very basic tasks, or you see an older person using their phone like this, before you write an angry blog post about it, or a letter to the editor, depending on what generation you're from, take a moment to step back, forget your age for a moment, maybe even remind yourself of something good that the other person's generation has done for you. Thanks. And then just quietly remind yourself that every generation sucks. Thank you.